Energy weapons tear the sky of Kaelus Prime apart. The once unified Vexxar people are now locked in a brutal civil war, and the planet itself is the ultimate prize. A lone scout named Jax screams a final, desperate warning over the comms. He reports the planet's life-giving core is destabilizing, that this conflict will crack the world wide open. Then, his transmission cuts to static, leaving only silence and the escalating firefight. By the end of this story, you will understand the terrifying power of a war that consumes not just armies, but entire worlds. You will discover the final, shocking moments of a planet torn asunder from within, and you will learn what fragile hope remained for the handful of survivors. What would you do if your very world was breaking apart beneath your feet? The Grand Spires' central chamber was a monument to unity, now filled with the sharp echo of betrayal. Counselor Zara faced General Krin across the polished floor, the air shimmering with the raw power of the core that pulsed deep beneath their feet. "You are not strategizing for defense. You are planning a massacre," Zara stated, her voice cutting through the hum of energy. "That power belongs to every Vexxar, not just your army." Krin did not even flinch, his gaze fixed on the strategic holograms floating between them. He spoke of necessity of a galaxy that would not tolerate weakness. He called the core the ultimate weapon, a key to dominance that their people were too sentimental to use. Zara stepped forward, her hand slicing through the holographic display of a core tap. "You would bleed our world dry for your war machines," she declared, the words ringing with a final, desperate truth. That single sentence hung in the air, a challenge that shattered all pretense of debate. Krin's signal was a subtle tilt of his head. His guards moved with brutal efficiency, seizing Zara's arms. Her struggle was not one of physical strength, but of pure defiance. "This act will not secure our future, General," she warned as they dragged her away. "It will end it." That moment in the spire was the spark. The schism was no longer a political disagreement. It was now a war, with the very soul of the planet as its prize. And far below, in the planet's heart, the core began to flicker in response to the violence brewing on the surface. The first true explosion of the Civil War did not come from the Grand Spires. It erupted on the molten plains of the Ignis Rift, where a military convoy, heavy with freshly siphoned core energy, snaked its way toward General Krin's primary fortress. Rebel Commander Vor, Zara's most trusted lieutenant, watched from a jagged ridge, his face illuminated by the sinister glow of the convoy's own cargo. He knew these were not mere supplies. They were the very lifeblood of the planet, stolen and weaponized. His orders crackled over the rebel comms, sharp and absolute. "Cut their power lines, but do not harm the civilians." His soldiers moved with precision, disabling the lead vehicles and severing the thick conduits that pulsed with raw energy. But the core was volatile, its essence unstable outside the planetary network. A severed line whipped back, sparking against an overloaded reactor housing. The chain reaction was instantaneous. A blinding white flash consumed the entire convoy, followed by a roar that shook the very foundations of the Ignis Rift. The blast was not just an explosion of metal and fire. It was a scream of pure planetary energy released in a single, catastrophic burst. That single detonation marked the war's first major casualty, and more importantly, the point of no return. The rebellion had drawn blood, but in doing so, they had proven the core itself was now a weapon. How do you fight an enemy when every blow you land wounds the world you are trying to save? Deep beneath the Grand Spires, in a lab carved from the planet's living rock, a lone scientist stared at his console in horror. Dr. Ilian watched the seismic sensors paint a terrifying picture across his screens. The data streams, usually a steady rhythm of green lines, were now a frantic mess of jagged red spikes. He listened to the raw data feed, translating the deep, resonant hum of the core into sound. The planet's heart was not just beating faster, it was screaming. He slammed his hand on the comms unit, his voice cracking with urgency as he connected to the military command channel. "The core's resonance frequency is shifting," he reported, the words tumbling out. "It is not a random event. It is a direct reaction to the energy weapons fire on the surface. The detonations are creating a sympathetic vibration, a destructive echo that is tearing the core's matrix apart from the inside." The response from command was a cold, static-laced dismissal. "The rebellion is the only instability we are concerned with, Doctor. Contain your alarm and focus on your duties." The channel went dead, leaving Elian alone with the screaming data. He knew then that the war was not just being fought on the surface. It was being mirrored in the planet's very soul, and the generals were too blind to see the true enemy. They were so focused on silencing the rebellion, they failed to hear the planet itself crying out in agony. What happens when the very ground you stand on becomes your most vocal opponent? Commander Lysa's private comm channel hummed with a traitor's silence. Her fingers danced across the console, inputting coordinates disguised as routine logistics updates. The message she sent was short, a whisper in the digital void meant only for General Krin. "Zara's forces are gathering at the Serif Falls. Strike now." She closed the channel, her face a mask of duty, while her actions condemned thousands. The rebels at the falls believed they were hidden, their position a natural fortress shielded by thundering waterfalls and jagged cliffs. They were preparing for a decisive push, a move they thought would turn the tide. They never considered a knife in the back from their own command structure. Krin's assault was swift and absolute. His gunships descended not from the expected approaches, but through the canyon's narrow eastern pass, a route the rebels had left unguarded because their own intelligence assured them it was impassable. Energy cannons lit up the misty chasm, their searing bolts turning the waterfalls into curtains of steam. The rebel vanguard, caught in the open as they mobilized, had no time to raise shields. The ambush was a slaughter. Soldiers who had fought for the soul of their planet were cut down by weapons powered by that very soul, their final moments shrouded in the vapor of their own sanctuary. In the aftermath, the silence at Serif Falls was more terrible than the roar of battle. The few survivors moved through the carnage, their grief hardening into something colder and more durable than sorrow. They now understood their enemy was not only across the battlefield. It was woven into their own ranks, a betrayal that made trust a luxury and every whispered order a potential death sentence. This was no longer just a war of ideals. It had become a fight for survival against an enemy that knew their every move. How do you win a war when you cannot even trust the person standing next to you? The resolve that emerged from the falls was not born of hope, but of a grim, unshakable certainty. They would win or they would die, but they would no longer be deceived. The silence of Helios was a heavy, suffocating blanket. This once great metropolis, now a ghost city of skeletal towers and empty plazas, held the key to the entire continent. Its central spire housed the planetary defense grid, a network of orbital cannons that General Krin had turned into a stranglehold on the rebellion. Commander Vor led his team through the shadowed canyons of its streets, their footsteps echoing in the profound quiet. Every shadow felt like a trap, every distant hum of machinery a potential alarm. Their mission was simple in objective, but impossibly dangerous in execution. Sabotage the mainframe, and for a brief, precious window, Krin would be blind and his fist unclenched. They moved like ghosts, bypassing dormant security drones and slipping through maintenance ducts that smelled of dust and decay. The control center itself was a cavernous room, dominated by a holographic projection of the planet, its surface dotted with the malevolent red icons of active defense platforms. The air was cold, humming with the immense power flowing through the conduits below the floor. Vor's technicians went to work immediately, their tools prying open access panels to reveal the intricate circuitry within. They were so close. Then a single, harsh klaxon shattered the silence, a patrol they had missed, a sensor they had tripped. Blue-armored loyalist soldiers poured into the chamber, their energy rifles already spitting lethal fire. The quiet exploded into chaos. The rebels took cover behind control consoles that sparked and smoked under the barrage. Vor returned fire, his own weapon a sharp retort in the confined space. He saw one of his technicians fall, a smoking hole in his chest. There was no time for grief, only for the mission. He shouted over the deafening roar of the firefight, his voice raw with urgency. Override the mainframe before their reinforcements arrive. Do it now. One remaining tech, a young woman named Kayla, ducked low and slammed a data spike into the primary terminal. Her fingers flew across the interface, lines of code scrolling faster than the eye could follow. Warning glyphs flashed across the main hologram, the red icons of the defense platforms flickering erratically. A loyalist plasma bolt seared past her head, scorching the console. She didn't flinch. With a final, decisive keystroke, the entire room plunged into darkness for a single, heart-stopping second. When the emergency lights flickered on, the planetary hologram was gone. Every one of those red icons had vanished. A collective, disbelieving silence fell over the loyalist troops for just a moment. That was all the opening the rebels needed. Vor and his surviving team fought their way out, leaving the control center a smoldering ruin. They had won. For the first time in months, the sky above Kaelus Prime belonged to no one. It was a temporary advantage, a fleeting gasp of freedom, but it was everything. What would you do with one clear shot at a tyrant, knowing it might be the only one you ever get? The clear sky one at Helios lasted for less than a single rotation. From every public screen and every military comm channel, General Krin's face appeared, his expression carved from cold stone. His voice was a flat, chilling monotone that offered no room for negotiation. "People of Kaelus Prime," he began, "your rebellion has cost us dearly. It ends now. You will lay down your arms and submit to my authority. The alternative is annihilation." He paused, letting the silence stretch into a suffocating weight. "If I do not receive unconditional surrender within 6 hours, I will authorize the use of the tectonic disruptors." The image on the screens shifted to a schematic of a massive, drill-like weapon boring into the planet's crust. This is not a blockade. It is not a siege. It is a promise. I will shatter the very ground you stand on. The broadcast cut out, leaving a planet holding its breath. The tectonic disruptors were the stuff of theoretical nightmares. A weapon system so dangerous even the old Unified Council had banned its development. It did not target cities or armies. It targeted the fragile tectonic plates that held the world together. Krin was not just threatening to defeat them. He was threatening to unmake their home. In a hidden bunker deep beneath the irradiated plains, Zara watched the broadcast, the faces of her commanders pale around her. A surrender would mean the end of their cause and the enslavement of their people. Fighting on meant he would make good on his threat. They were trapped between a tyrant and the abyss. Zara stood, her own resolve hardening into something sharp and final. She knew they could not win a war of attrition, and they could not surrender. There was only one path left, a move so desperate it bordered on suicide. If Krin was willing to break the world to control it, then they would have to risk everything to save its heart. "We do not surrender," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "We take the fight to him. We go for the core. Our only chance is to reach the planetary core first and initiate the emergency stabilization protocol. It is the one thing he cannot afford to destroy." It was a race against the planet's own death sentence. Could a small team infiltrate the most heavily fortified location on Kaelus Prime and perform a miracle, all before a madman pulled the trigger on global destruction? The fate of a world now rested on a single, desperate countermove. The bunker's air was thick with fear and the scent of recycled oxygen, but Zara's voice cut through it like a blade. "We fight not for power, but for our planet's very soul." Her words were not a plea, but a declaration that echoed off the cold walls and into the hearts of the huddled rebels. She stood before them not as a counselor in exile, but as a commander who saw the only path forward. "Krin threatens to shatter the ground beneath our feet, but his power, all of it, flows from a single source. The core, he has turned its energy into a weapon, but he has forgotten its true purpose. It is the heart of Kaelus Prime, and every heart has a pacemaker." She gestured to a shimmering hologram that bloomed in the air beside her, depicting a complex, crystalline device housed deep within the planet's crust. This is the primary core stabilizer. It is the only mechanism that can regulate the planet's energy flow and force it back into a stable rhythm. In Krin's hands, it would become a chokehold, a way to control the very lifeblood of our world indefinitely. But in our hands, she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, it becomes a key. If we can activate the full stabilization protocol, we can heal the core's violent fluctuations. We can render his tectonic disruptors useless because they would have nothing volatile left to exploit. The war would not be won with a bomb, but with a heartbeat. A quiet murmur spread through the bunker. The sheer audacity of the plan was its only shield. Infiltrate the most fortified location on the planet, bypass Krin's entire army, and perform a delicate procedure on the unstable heart of the world, all before a 6-hour deadline expired. This was not a battle of armies anymore. It was a surgical strike against the disease, not the symptoms. Zara's gambit was a race to save the patient by restarting its heart, while the enemy stood ready with a knife. Could a handful of rebels succeed where an entire army had failed? The fate of a world now rested on a single, impossible healing. The core stabilizer facility was a cathedral of planetary energy, its vast chamber dominated by the humming crystalline device that was their only hope. They had fought through layers of loyalist defenses to reach it, but the final barrier was not a door or a wall. It was General Krin's champion, a hulking warrior named Burrows, who stood between them and the control console, his armor scarred and his energy pike crackling with lethal intent. Commander Vor stepped forward, his own weapon humming to life. The rest of the rebel team fanned out, engaging the remaining loyalist guards in a storm of searing plasma bolts and shouted commands. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and the screech of clashing energies. "Your greed will be your epitaph," Burrows, Vor snarled, deflecting a powerful swing of the pike. "The stabilizer is not a prize to be won, it is a life to be saved." Burrows answered not with words, but with a furious assault, each blow meant to kill. He fights for power, Vor realized, ducking under a swipe that would have taken his head. I fight for a heartbeat. Their duel became the center of the storm, a microcosm of the entire war. Around them, the battle for the console raged. A rebel soldier fell, her cry cut short. Another loyalist was thrown back from a control panel, his armor smoldering. Vor saw an opening, a slight overextension in Burrows's aggressive lunge. He did not aim for a killing strike, but for the pike itself. His blade connected with the weapon's haft, shearing through its power conduit. The pike exploded in a shower of sparks, blinding Burrows for a critical second. Vor drove his shoulder into the champion's chest, sending the massive warrior stumbling back into a bank of sparking machinery. Burrows collapsed, stunned. There was no time for a final blow. Vor turned, his eyes locking on the primary control interface. He sprinted through the chaos, the fate of a world measured in his pounding footsteps. His hand reached for the console, for the sequence that would begin the stabilization protocol. But as his fingers touched the cool interface, a new, deeper tremor shook the entire facility. It was not the vibration of battle. It was the groan of the planet itself. The tectonic disruptors had been activated. Had they reached the heart of the world only to feel its last, dying beat? The console in the rebel command post hissed with a captured data stream, the decoded words hanging in the air like poison. Commander Vor stared at the transcription, each line a fresh wound. The troop movements at Serif Falls, the security schedules for Helios, all of it laid bare. The source was a code designation he knew too well, Lysa. He moved without a word, his face a mask of cold stone, his soldiers falling in behind him as he strode toward her quarters. He found her packing a single bag, her movements efficient and calm. She did not startle when he entered, only looked up, her eyes holding a deep, resigned sorrow. "Why, Lysa?" Vor's voice was low, a razor's edge of controlled fury. "Why turn against your own people?" The soldiers behind him shifted, their hands resting on their weapons. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Lysa did not reach for a weapon. She simply closed her bag and met his gaze. "Krin has my family, Vor, my children. They are in a secure bunker deep within his territory." She spoke the words with a chilling clarity. "He showed me the projections, the same ones Elian deciphered. He knows the core is failing. He knows the planet is dying." Her voice wavered for the first time. "He promised me their survival, a place on his ark, safe from the Cataclysm. What was I supposed to do? Let them die for a principle?" The moral conflict in the room was a physical weight. Vor saw not a monster before him, but a mother who had been given an impossible choice: betray thousands to save two, or remain loyal and condemn her own flesh and blood. Her treachery had cost countless lives, yet her reason was a terrible human logic that echoed in the silence. It was a choice between the future of a world and the lives of her world. In that tense, awful moment, the clear lines of the war blurred into a painful shade of gray. How far would you go to save the ones you love, when every path forward is paved with the blood of the innocent? The ground did not simply shake, it roared. Far from the core stabilizer, in fortified bunkers deep beneath Loyalist territory, General Krin gave the final order. Against every warning, against the frantic data streams screaming from Dr. Ilian's lab, the tectonic disruptors fired. Their energy did not explode outward. It drilled down, deep into the fragile seams of the planet's crust, targeting the regions where rebel sympathies ran deepest. The effect was not a localized quake. It was a surgical strike against the planet's very skeleton. In the city of Viridia, built across a series of majestic canyon bridges, the ground beneath the central plaza simply split open. The great stone spans, wonders of Vexxar engineering, crumbled like dry clay, swallowed by a chasm that glowed with a sickly orange light from the world's exposed mantle. The sound was a deep, grinding shriek of rock and dying metal. From a Loyalist command ship hovering safely in the upper atmosphere, a panicked officer's voice broke through the comms, his professional composure utterly gone. "Sir, the disruptors have overloaded. The energy feedback is catastrophic. The core's energy field is collapsing." The officer's next words were a whisper of pure horror. "We have started a chain reaction we cannot stop." The weapon had not just cracked the surface. It had struck a mortal blow to the planet's already faltering heart. The chain reaction was a fire spreading along the lines of the world's own life force. Deep beneath the stabilizer facility, Commander Vor felt the floor lurch, not with the impact of an explosion, but with a nauseating, rolling wave. The humming of the great crystalline device, which had been a steady drone, suddenly pitched into a frantic, shrieking whine. The very air flickered with uncontrolled energy discharges. They had arrived to save the core, but Krin, in his final, desperate act of control, had already killed the patient. The war for Kaelus Prime was over. The death of the world had officially begun. What do you do when the battlefield itself is dying beneath your feet? A planetary scream erupted from every sensor and comms unit on Kaelus Prime. It was not the sound of weapons or soldiers, but the raw, digital shriek of a world in its death throes. The core had passed its breaking point, entering a terminal feedback loop. In bunkers and command centers on both sides of the conflict, scientists who had been enemies moments before found their screens displaying the same catastrophic data. Dr. Elian, his voice trembling with a grief that transcended allegiance, opened a planet-wide emergency channel. He was joined by his loyalist counterpart, their professional rivalry erased by a shared, horrifying truth. The structural integrity is failing, they reported in unison, their voices a stark, synthesized duet of doom. The planet will break apart in hours unless we shut down all weapons and reactors immediately. Every single energy draw, from a soldier's rifle to a city's power grid, was now fuel for the core's self-destruction. The very power they had fought over was now actively tearing their world to pieces. The war had become a collective suicide pact. For the first time, there was no rebel or loyalist position, only the undeniable, final math of annihilation. Could armies that had spent years trying to destroy each other now find the unity to stand down and silence the guns, all to save the very ground that was already cracking beneath them? The fate of every living soul on Kaelus Prime now hinged on a single, impossible ceasefire. The command center was a tomb of static and dread. Zara's fingers trembled as she input the highest priority encryption code, a channel reserved for planetary emergencies that had never been used for a conversation like this. The screen flickered, and General Krin's face appeared, his usual mask of cold command now strained by the raw data of global collapse scrolling beside him. His voice was a low growl stripped of its former arrogance. "This is a trick, Zara, a final, pathetic gambit." Zara did not flinch. She leaned into the pickup, her eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "Look at your own seismic readings, Krin. This is not a trick. It is a funeral dirge. Your disruptors have triggered a core cascade. Call off your attack. Silence every weapon under your command, or we all die." There is no victory here, only ash. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic beeping of proximity alerts from both sides. Krin's gaze dropped to a secondary screen, to the same horrifying projections Elian's team was seeing. He saw the truth of it, the inescapable math of mutual destruction. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He had wanted to rule a world, not preside over its funeral. "A temporary ceasefire," he conceded, the words seeming to physically pain him. "All offensive operations will stand down for 1 hour. But if this is a deception," Zara cut him off, her voice flat and final. "The only deception was the one we told ourselves, that this world could survive our war. 1 hour. Use it to save what is left of your soul, General." The channel closed, plunging the room back into a fragile silence. The order went out across the battlefields of Kaelus Prime. In the fiery trenches of the Ignis rift, a loyalist soldier lowered his rifle, watching in confusion as a rebel across the smoldering divide did the same. In the shattered streets of Veridia, the thunder of artillery ceased, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the groan of collapsing buildings and the distant, ever-present rumble of the planet itself. But this was not peace. It was a pause, a held breath. On both sides, commanders knew the clock was ticking. Hidden agendas coiled in the silence. Krin's technicians were already scrambling, not to save the planet, but to calculate the viability of his secret Ark project, determining if 1 hour was enough to secure the final resources for a select few to escape. Zara's rebels, meanwhile, saw the ceasefire not as a reprieve, but as their last, best chance to reach the core stabilizer and attempt the impossible. The guns were silent, but the war for survival had merely entered a new, more desperate phase. Could a truce built on the edge of oblivion possibly hold when every second was spent planning for a future the other side sought to steal? The planet's dying scream was a vibration in the very metal of the access conduit. Commander Vor led his team at a dead run, their boots echoing in the narrow, spiraling tunnel that plunged toward the planet's heart. This was no longer a military operation. It was a descent into a tomb, and they were racing to perform a miracle before the burial was complete. "We must reach the chamber first," Vor shouted over the groan of stressed rock, his voice raw. "Only our stabilizer protocol can save what is left of our world." He knew with a cold certainty that Krin was not sending his own elite unit to save anything. The general wanted to seize the core, to drain the last of its energy for his arc, leaving a hollow, brittle shell that would shatter the moment his ships escaped the atmosphere. Their paths converged in the geothermal vents, massive natural shafts that offered the fastest route down. Vor's team repelled into the oppressive heat, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and ozone. Far across the cavernous, steaming chasm, he saw the telltale glint of Loyalist armor. A squad of Krin's best descending on parallel lines. There was no time for a firefight here, suspended over a lake of magma. It was a pure race, a test of speed and nerve. A Loyalist soldier lost his grip, his scream swallowed by the abyss. A rebel's cable snapped, sending him plummeting into the glowing orange below. The losses were noted and filed away, grim sacrifices to the unforgiving clock. They reached the bottom of the vent, a precarious ledge overlooking the final approach to the core chamber's massive iris door. The Loyalists landed simultaneously on an adjacent platform. For a moment, the two groups simply stared at each other across the boiling gulf, the fate of a world hanging between them. Then both commanders shouted the same order. "Blow the door." The simultaneous explosions ripped through the ancient machinery, and the great door shuddered, its locking mechanisms shearing apart with a final, metallic shriek. As the dust cleared, the two teams charged into the heart of the dying world, not as conquerors, but as the final arbiters of its legacy. Would they be its healers or its final pallbearers? The core chamber was a maelstrom of light and noise, a cavernous heart tearing itself apart. Crystalline conduits lining the walls flashed between blinding white and a sickly, failing orange, their hum now a deafening shriek. The air itself felt thick, charged with the planet's death rattle. And in the center of the storm, standing across the central control dais, Zara and Krin finally faced each other. There were no armies between them now, only the shuddering floor and the few soldiers who had survived the descent. Zara's weapon was raised, her aim steady despite the tremors. "This ends now, Krin, for Kaelus." Her voice cut through the chaos, not as a challenge but as a statement of finality. There was no hesitation. Krin's answer was a blast from his plasma rifle, and the chamber erupted into a brutal, close-quarters firefight. This was not a battle for territory or ideology anymore. It was a brawl for the planet's last breath. Loyalist and rebel soldiers clashed among the sparking consoles, their struggles illuminated by the strobing light of the unstable core. Every shot, every scream was underscored by the deep, groaning protest of the world's structure. Zara and Krin circled the central dais, their duel the focal point of the chaos. "He fights for a legacy of control," Zara thought, deflecting a searing bolt of energy. "I fight for a legacy of life." Krin was a force of pure, relentless aggression, his attacks fueled by a lifetime of command, and the bitter knowledge that his empire was crumbling around him. He would rather shatter the final piece than let another claim it. Zara moved with a different energy, a defensive, calculated precision. She was not trying to kill him, but to get past him, to reach the primary stabilizer interface that glowed just behind his position. The fate of their entire civilization, every memory, every future that could have been, was being decided in this single, violent argument at the edge of oblivion. Could a single act of preservation triumph over a lifetime of conquest? When the very stage of their conflict was collapsing into the abyss, Vor's hand slammed down on the stabilizer's activation rune. For one fleeting, beautiful second, the shrieking whine of the core dropped to a low, steady hum. The frantic, strobing lights calmed into a gentle, rhythmic pulse. A collective breath was held across the chamber. Then, a sound like a mountain breaking in half-echoed from deep within the machine. A web of brilliant, white-hot cracks raced across the surface of the great crystalline device. It was not healing. It was a final, violent seizure. The overload was instantaneous. The stabilizer did not just shut down, it detonated. A silent, blinding wave of pure force erupted from the dais, vaporizing the control consoles and hurling bodies like leaves in a hurricane. The chamber's integrity vanished as the supporting arches, fused to the core's own energy matrix, shattered into molten slag. Zara was thrown back against a buckling wall. The scream ripped from her lungs not from pain, but from a profound, soul-crushing realization. It is too late. The core is tearing itself apart. Her words were swallowed by the roar of the planet's death cry. The shockwave did not stop at the chamber. It radiated outward through the planetary crust, a tsunami of destructive energy. On the surface, continents themselves began to groan. The ceasefire, that fragile, desperate pause, was rendered meaningless in an instant. The war was over because the battlefield was committing suicide. The very light in the sky began to flicker and fail as the planet's heart ripped open. What do you do when the doctor's final attempt to save the patient instead stops their heart for good? The ground beneath General Krin's feet did not just crack, it dissolved. A continent-wide fissure ripped through the chamber floor. A glowing maw of raw planetary energy that vaporized the polished stone and swallowed loyalist and rebel soldiers alike without a sound. The shriek of tearing metal was drowned out by a deeper, more primal roar, the sound of a world unmaking itself. Krin stumbled back from the abyss, his weapon clattering from his grasp, his eyes wide with a horror that eclipsed all ambition. His voice was a broken whisper, lost in the cataclysm but etched on his face for any who could see. What have I done? It was not a question for his enemies or even for his soldiers. It was a confession to the dying planet itself. The tectonic disruptors had not just cracked the crust. They had severed the final, fragile threads holding Kaelus Prime together. Across the globe, the same nightmare unfolded. In the frozen northern wastes, glaciers the size of cities calved into newly formed seas of magma. The great agricultural plains of the southern hemisphere were now a fractured puzzle of floating islands, their edges crumbling into fiery chasms. The sky itself was bleeding, a sickly mix of ash and released core energy that turned the air into a toxic, shimmering haze. The war, the factions, the cause, none of it mattered anymore. There were no more sides, only the shared, screaming reality of a global burial. How do you process an ending when the very ground you trusted to hold you up is turning to dust beneath your feet? The planet was not falling apart in one single explosion, but in a relentless, grinding cascade of destruction, each failure triggering the next, an unstoppable domino effect of planetary death. There was no frontline left to hold, no strategy left to devise. There was only the long, terrifying fall. Bor's grip on Zara's arm was the only solid thing left in a world coming undone. He hauled her over a landscape that was no longer ground, but a tilting plate of shattered rock, the sky above a furious canvas of fire and escaping atmosphere. "We have to go now." His scream was barely a whisper against the planet's final, deafening roar. Behind them, the horizon itself was curving upward, vast continents tearing free from the planetary mantle and hurling monstrous fragments into the void. This was not an explosion to be outrun. It was an unraveling, the very fabric of their world disintegrating around them. The evacuation ships were not a guarantee of safety. They were mere specks of hope against an astronomical cataclysm. Loyalist and rebel alike fought not for a cause, but for a handhold on a crawling transport ramp, their shared terror erasing the last vestiges of their war. Vor shoved Zara into the crowded belly of a military dropship, its engines screaming under the strain of a disintegrating gravity well. He took one last look back at the birthplace of his entire species. The site was not one of fire and rock, but of memory itself being annihilated. Cities, forests, and oceans were now just glittering dust scattered across the growing void. The ship lurched violently as it cleared the crumbling docking bay, escaping the gravitational pull of a corpse. They were not flying away from a battlefield. They were fleeing the funeral of a world. In that moment, huddled in the shuddering darkness of the transport, the survivors faced a silence more terrifying than the noise. They had lost everything, but they had gained a single, horrifying truth. They were now the last echoes of a world that had been murdered not by an alien force, but by its own children. What do you become when you are all that remains of a dead planet? Silence filled the bridge of the refugee ship, a void deeper than the space they now fled into. Zara stood before the main viewscreen, her reflection a ghost against the star-dusted black. Behind that image, the true horror played out. Kaelus Prime was no longer a world, but a vast, expanding cloud of incandescent dust and rock. Its final light a funeral pyre that would shine for centuries. She reached for the comms panel, her fingers feeling unnaturally heavy. This was not a call for help. It was an epitaph. She opened a channel on all frequencies, a broadcast meant to echo through the void for any civilization advanced enough to hear it. Her voice was quiet, stripped of all anger, carrying only the weight of 1 billion extinguished lives. Let our fate be a warning. Her words were not a shout, but a whisper that carried the force of a dying star. War without wisdom destroys all. On the screen, a final, violent pulse of light flared from the debris field, the last gasp of the planetary core. Then, the transmission from the planet's surface, every channel filled with the static of battle and panic, cut to an absolute, eternal silence. The Civil War was over, not with a treaty, but with a single, irrevocable act of cosmic erasure. Zara's message was now the only thing left of her world, a beacon of sorrow sent out into the uncaring galaxy. It was a plea carved from ash and regret, a story of how a people so advanced, so full of potential, had chosen to use their greatest gifts not to nurture their home, but to dig its grave. Would anyone in the vast and silent deep be listening? And if they were, would they be wise enough to understand the price of a dead world? The void outside the viewports was no longer empty, but filled with the spectral glow of their former home. 1 billion souls had been silenced, and the silence within the refugee fleet was a heavy, living thing. In the main hangar of the largest surviving cruiser, survivors huddled together. The crisp lines of rebel grays and loyalist blues were smudged with the same grime and ash, their weariness a universal uniform. Commander Vor stepped onto a makeshift platform, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound. He looked out at the faces, not as a warrior to his troops, but as one survivor to another. We are all that remains of Kaelus Prime. His voice was quiet, yet it carried to the farthest corner of the bay. There are no loyalists here, no rebels, there are only Vexxar. The old divisions that carved up our world mean nothing in the face of that. He gestured toward the viewport, toward the distant, expanding cloud of dust that was once their entire history. Our future cannot be built on the same foundations that led to that. It must be different. It must be built on the one thing we forgot in our rush to destroy each other. Our shared survival. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of disagreement, but of a profound, weary acknowledgement. A loyalist officer, his arm in a sling, slowly removed his rank insignia and let it clatter to the deck. A rebel technician nearby did the same with her faction's armband. It was not a surrender, but a shedding, a silent agreement to let the old identities die with the world that bred them. In that hangar, adrift in the infinite black, the first fragile seed of a new society was planted. It was a seed watered not by ambition or power, but by the collective memory of a planet's scream. Could a people born from such absolute destruction ever learn to build again? The ghostly light of the nebula cast long shadows in the command center, a place still reeking of ozone and grief. A soft, persistent chime broke the silence, a sound that had once signaled routine traffic. But there was no routine anymore, only the void. The young sensor officer, her face pale under the dim glow of her screen, turned toward Commander Vor. Her voice was a tight whisper. "Sir, we have an unidentified contact. On an intercept course, it is not one of ours. Its energy signature is alien." That single word, alien, cut through the lingering fog of their shared trauma. On the main view screen, a new blip appeared, a stark, unknown geometry against the starfield. It moved with a purpose that was neither the frantic scramble of a refugee ship, nor the aggressive posture of a Krin loyalist. This was something else entirely, something from beyond the graveyard of their world. The internal alarms that had been silent since the ceasefire began to flash again, but this time they were not colored by faction. Every person on the bridge, from the former rebel commander to the loyalist technician who had just hours before been an enemy, looked at the screen with the same primal wariness. Their civil war, with all its bitter arguments and betrayals, was suddenly a distant, petty quarrel. The destruction of Kaelus Prime had not just ended their conflict. It had erased the borders of their old fears and replaced them with a single, unifying question. Were they being hunted? The survivors of a planetary suicide now faced their first, terrifying test as a unified people. Could a fleet born from ashes stand against a predator from the dark? A medical bay's sterile light washed over Zara as she struggled to sit up, her body protesting every movement. The alert chime was a persistent drill in her skull. She gripped the edge of the cot, her knuckles white, open a channel. Her voice was a rasp, but it held an iron core of command. Hail them, but be ready for anything. On the main bridge view screen, the alien vessel hung in perfect, unnerving stillness. It was a silhouette of sharp angles and smooth curves, absorbing the surrounding starlight rather than reflecting it. For a long moment, there was only the hum of their own ship's systems and the frantic beating of 1,000 hearts. Then, a voice filled the comms. It was not a sound spoken through a mouth, but a resonance that seemed to form directly in the mind, translated by their systems into cold, precise words. "We observed your world's end. Your conflict has drawn attention you may not want." The message ended as abruptly as it began, leaving a silence more terrifying than any threat. It was not an offer of help, nor a declaration of war. It was a statement of fact, a cosmic judgment passed on their extinct civilization. They had been so consumed with watching each other, they never considered who might be watching them. The attention they had drawn was not from a single curious neighbor, but from the void itself, and it had found them at their absolute weakest. What kind of attention arrives only after the funeral is over? The survivors now faced a new, chilling reality. Their war had not just destroyed their home, it had made them a spectacle for forces they could not possibly comprehend. The alien vessel remained motionless, a dark cutout against the sea of stars. A new presence materialized on the bridge, not as a physical form, but as a shimmering holographic projection. It was a tall, slender being with large, luminous eyes that held the deep calm of a still ocean. She introduced herself as Ilara, her voice a gentle resonance in their minds. "We are observers," she began, "chroniclers of endings. We do not come to conquer or to save. We are here only to listen to the echoes of the fallen. Your Kaelus Prime is the seventh world we have witnessed consume itself in this manner." A stunned silence gripped the bridge. Ilara's gaze swept over the haggard survivors, her expression one of profound, ancient sorrow. "Your civil war was a tragedy, but it was not unique. The pattern is always the same. A species reaches for the stars, only to turn its greatest discoveries inward as weapons against itself. The thirst for power eclipses the instinct for preservation." We record these stories, she continued, not as warnings, for warnings are seldom heeded, but as a question. We seek to understand the flaw in the logic of intelligent life. Why does the path to greatness so often lead to the precipice of self-annihilation? Is it an unavoidable step in a civilization's evolution, or a choice that can be unmade? Her words were not an accusation, but a quiet, devastating inquiry that forced every survivor to look inward. They had been so certain of their righteousness, so convinced their cause was just. Now, they were merely a point in a galactic cycle of failure. Their entire history reduced to a repeating pattern in an alien archive. What does it mean to learn your greatest tragedy is not a unique catastrophe, but a common, predictable mistake? Ilara's holographic hand gestured, and the bridge was suddenly enveloped by a star chart of breathtaking scale. Pinpricks of light flared into existence, each one marking a different star system. 7 of them pulsed with a slow, ominous red. One of those was Kaelus Prime. The others were alien suns, names unknown to any Vexxar. Each red star was accompanied by a cascade of data, a tragic story told in cold numbers and translated fragments of final transmissions. One showed a world encased in ice, its inhabitants having weaponized the climate itself in a war for thermal dominance. Another depicted a civilization that had collapsed into nanite swarms, devouring their own biosphere in a conflict over digital purity. The sheer repetition was a hammer blow to the soul. Power unchecked by empathy always leads to ruin. Ilara's words were not a judgment, but a quiet, galactic epitaph repeated 7 times over. Zara felt the air leave her lungs. She saw her own righteous arguments mirrored in the frantic, self-justifying logs of a long-dead admiral from a world called Cygnus Beta. Krin, standing apart, stared at the ghost of a society that had perfected orbital bombardment, only to shatter their own planet's crust in a final act of spite. He saw his own brutal logic reflected back at him, stripped of its context and its flags, reduced to the same fatal equation. Their war, their deeply personal grievances and passionately held beliefs, were just another iteration of a cosmic failure. They had not been special. They had been predictable. The true cost of their actions was not just the dust of their home, but the chilling realization that they had become a statistic in a universe where intelligence seems to be a prelude to self-destruction. Can you even call it a tragedy when it is just a pattern waiting to be repeated? The silence on the bridge was no longer peaceful, but thick with a new kind of tension. Ilara's hologram flickered patiently, her offer of chronicling their end still hanging in the air. It was Vor who broke the stalemate, his voice rough from smoke and command. "We need allies, not more secrets." His gaze swept across the faces of the unified survivors. "We are a handful of ships, wounded and alone. We have just witnessed the ultimate consequence of isolation and suspicion. To turn away from a potential hand, even an enigmatic one, is to repeat the very mistake that killed our world." Across the command deck, Krin stepped forward, his posture rigid. His eyes were fixed on the alien vessel on the viewscreen. They could be predators. His voice was low, stripped of its former bluster and replaced with a veteran's cold pragmatism. "They did not arrive to help us during the war. They arrived after the kill to study the carcass. What is their true purpose? To record our story, or to ensure we do not get the chance to write another? This is not unity, it is naivete. We must flee while we still can." The rift that opened between them was not the old divide of rebel and loyalist. It was a fundamental split in how to face the unknown. One side saw a terrifying opportunity for connection, a chance to break the cycle Ilara had described. The other saw a classic tactical trap, a threat that demanded immediate evasion. The survivors, who had only just begun to shed their old identities, now found themselves forced into a new, more desperate choice. Could their fragile unity survive its first real test? a decision that would determine whether they became partners in a galactic conversation or permanent refugees in the dark. The choice hung in the air, a fragile thing in the sterile light of the bridge. Ilara's luminous eyes seemed to see directly into the heart of their fear and division. "We can offer you sanctuary," she resonated, her voice a calm pool in the midst of their turmoil. "A world exists, a refuge for those who have learned the ultimate cost of conflict. But there is a condition. You must renounce warfare as a solution, or we cannot help you. You must vow to never again raise a weapon in organized violence against another intelligent being." The silence that followed was absolute. To renounce war was not merely to lay down their guns, which were already cold and silent. It was to dismantle the very architecture of their society, a civilization built upon the concept of defense, of armies, of strategic dominance. It was to abandon the core tenet that had defined the Vexxar for millennia, the belief that strength was the final arbiter of disputes. Commander Vor felt the weight of the offer immediately. His entire life had been a testament to fighting for what was right. Yet, he had just witnessed where that path led. To accept was to embrace a radical new way of existence, to finally break the cycle Ilara had shown them. How could they refuse a chance to heal, to build something that would not inevitably crumble into dust? But General Krin's voice cut through the silence like a shard of ice. "This is not an offer, it is a surrender." His gaze swept across the other survivors, many of whom were former soldiers. "They ask us to become helpless, to trust our future to their mercy." What happens when the next threat emerges, one that does not share their philosophy? Do we simply lie down and die? We would be trading one extinction for another, a slower, more humiliating one. The fleet fractured along this new, painful line. It was no longer about past allegiances, but about the fundamental nature of their future. Some saw the vow as the only logical step forward, the necessary amputation of a diseased limb to save the body. Others saw it as a suicide pact, a voluntary disarmament that would leave them vulnerable in a universe that had just proven itself to be cold and watchful. Could a people born from the ashes of a world forged in fire ever truly renounce the flame? The sanctuary world promised survival, but at the cost of their very identity as Vexxar. The alternative was the endless, terrifying freedom of the void, where they could remain who they were, and risk repeating every mistake that had led them here. The silence on the bridge was a physical weight, pressing down on the last survivors of a world. Zara stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the unified fleet on the main view screen. "Kaelus Prime is gone." Her voice was quiet, but it carried the gravity of a collapsing star. "Its dust is the only monument to our failure, to a war we were so certain we had to fight. Let that destruction be our last war. We have a chance to choose a different path, one that does not lead to another graveyard in the void. To accept the observer's terms is not surrender. It is evolution. It is our vow that the scream of our planet will not be just another echo in their archive, but the sound of a cycle breaking. We choose to build, not with weapons, but with our hands and our wills." The vote was not a formal count of hands or a digital tally. It was a shift in the very air of the ship, a collective exhale of a people too exhausted by fire to ever pick up a torch again. One by one, the ship captains across the fleet signaled their assent. It was not a cheer of victory, but a quiet, solemn agreement, a shared understanding that the price of their old way of life had been the entire world. In the main hangar bay, the final, symbolic act began. It was not a grand ceremony, but a somber, necessary ritual. Former Loyalist soldiers and rebel fighters stood side by side, their hands working together to feed the last of their heavy weapons, their plasma rifles and energy pikes, into the industrial reclaimers. The metal screamed as it was melted down, not into new instruments of war, but into raw, shapeless ingots. There were no flags, no anthems, only the hiss of molten alloy and the shared, silent grief for what they had lost and what they were finally, irrevocably giving up. This was not an act of weakness, but the ultimate expression of a newfound, hard-won strength. Could a people who had defined themselves by their capacity for conflict learn to define themselves by their capacity for peace? The ingots, still glowing with residual heat, were all that remained of their war, a silent promise cast in metal that they would never again make the same fatal mistake. The reclaimed metal ingots were still warm when the alien vessel began to move. It slid through the void, a silent guide, and a shimmering tear in the fabric of space itself rippled open before it. This was not a jump to light speed, a technology the Vexxar understood. This was a gateway, a tunnel of swirling, impossible colors that led into the absolute unknown. The refugee fleet, a chain of wounded ships holding its breath, followed their enigmatic escort into the light. The transition was not a roar of engines, but a sensation of falling upward, of the universe folding in on itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. They emerged into a star system drenched in tranquility. A single, gentle sun cast a warm, golden light upon a pristine world of blues and greens, its surface unmarred by the gray scars of cities or the fiery wounds of battle. Commander Vor stood at the viewport, his reflection a ghost against the vibrant planet below. He watched the untouched continents, the vast, calm oceans, and the swirl of white clouds. A profound shift settled within him, the weight of the past giving way to the sheer possibility of the future. "We are not just survivors anymore," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "We are pioneers now." This world offered no pre-built cities, no inherited infrastructure, and no monuments to past glories. It offered only soil, water, and air, a blank page upon which they could write a new story, one free from the old, bloody chapters of their history. The chance to start again, from absolute zero, was both the most terrifying and the most beautiful gift they could have ever received. What would you build if you were given a whole new world and a promise to never repeat your gravest mistake? The air of Viridia was the first to fill their lungs, a crisp, sweet mixture of alien pollen and clean rain. It carried no scent of smoke or ozone, no memory of fire. Commander Vor knelt, his fingers sinking into the rich, dark soil, a stark contrast to the cold metal decks that had been his home for so long. Around him, the refugees stood in silent awe, their eyes tracing the vibrant purple fronds of the forests and the twin moons that already hung in the lavender sky. Zara walked a few paces ahead, her hand resting on the trunk of a tree with bark that shimmered like mother of pearl. She turned to face the gathered survivors, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried on the gentle wind. "We will build a society worthy of our sacrifice. This time our foundations will not be power or fear, but memory and respect." The work began not with grand declarations, but with quiet, determined action. The reclaimed ingots of their melted-down weapons were the first materials used, not for walls or fortifications, but for the framework of a communal hall. It was a powerful, unspoken symbol. The very instruments of their old conflict would now house their new beginnings. The observers did not command or direct. Instead, Ilara and her kind moved among them, offering gentle guidance. They showed them how to weave the strong, flexible native grasses into sturdy, weatherproof roofs. They pointed out which fruits were nourishing and which underground springs ran the purest. It was not a transfer of technology, but of wisdom, a lesson in how to live with a world rather than simply on it. As the first structures rose, simple and elegant against the untamed landscape, a new rhythm took hold. Former soldiers who had once aimed rifles at each other now worked together to lift a support beam into place. Engineers who had designed siege engines now collaborated on irrigation channels. There were no ranks, no uniforms, only people united by a shared loss and a collective purpose. The silence of Viridia was no longer filled with the ghosts of war. but with the sounds of construction, of gentle conversation, and of a fragile, growing hope. Could they truly leave their warrior past behind and learn the delicate art of peace, one carefully placed stone at a time? The first meeting of the council was held under the open sky, the twin moons of Viridia casting a soft, silver light upon the three figures seated on simple stone benches. Zara, Krin, and Vor faced the gathered community, their past animosities now a quiet weight in the air between them. Zara spoke first, her voice clear and firm. "Our strength will be in unity, not in force." These words became the cornerstone of their new code, the first law of their colony. It was a radical declaration, a complete reversal of the philosophy that had governed their people for millennia. They were not here to conquer this world, but to belong to it. The laws they drafted that evening were not about control or punishment, but about mutual support and collective responsibility. Every rule was designed to prevent the old patterns from taking root. The right to speak in assembly was guaranteed to every adult. Decisions required a consensus of the council, meaning no single voice, not even Krin's, could override the others. The use of violence to resolve disputes was permanently outlawed, replaced by a system of mediation and communal judgment. It was a framework built not on the fear of power, but on the power of shared purpose. Could a government forged from such bitter rivals ever truly hold? Or were they simply planting the seeds of a future, more subtle conflict? The gentle hum of the water purifier was the steady heartbeat of Viridia, until it was replaced by a deafening crack that echoed across the settlement. A plume of dark, acrid smoke rose from the purification hub, and the clear water flowing into the communal reservoirs slowed to a muddy, contaminated trickle. The colony's newfound peace shattered in an instant, replaced by the primal fear of thirst. An investigation began immediately, not with accusations, but with a careful sifting of the wreckage. The evidence was undeniable. This was not a system failure. The explosion's origin point and the traces of a crude, chemical trigger pointed to a deliberate, calculated act of sabotage. A cold dread settled over the leadership council. Someone among them, someone they had broken bread with and built alongside, had chosen to poison their one chance at a new beginning. How do you find an enemy who wears the face of a neighbor? And how do you stop them when your most sacred law forbids the very violence they have embraced? Zara, Vor, and Krin were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. The war for Kaelus Prime had not ended. It had simply followed them, hidden in the hearts of a few, waiting for the moment to strike at the colony's most vulnerable point. Their vow to renounce violence was now their greatest vulnerability and their ultimate test. Could they root out this poison without becoming poisoned themselves? They had to find the saboteurs not with weapons, but with the very unity the attack was meant to destroy. The community gathered not in anger, but in a somber assembly under the twin moons. Zara stood before them, her face illuminated by the emergency lanterns, her voice steady but grave. "We have built our homes with the metal of our past wars," she began, her words carrying across the silent crowd. "Now, a sickness from that past seeks to destroy our future. It is a sickness of the spirit, one that believes in power through fear. We will not fight it with its own tools. We will fight it with light. We will find those responsible not by force but by truth. We ask anyone with knowledge, any shred of information, to come forward. Your voice, not your silence, will save us." The response was not a chaotic uproar, but a quiet, determined mobilization. The colony became its own detective. Engineers who understood the Purifier's schematics worked alongside former soldiers who could analyze the explosive's components. People shared where they had been, who they had seen. It was a communal effort built on trust, a stark contrast to the lone act of betrayal. Slowly, a pattern emerged from the whispers and the shared observations. A locked storage container had been forced open. Precious chemical supplies used for soil enrichment were missing. and a few colonists recalled seeing a small group, always together, always on the periphery, working the night shift near the water hub. The evidence was circumstantial, a collection of threads, but when woven together, they pointed to a handful of individuals still fiercely loyal to General Krin's old ideology. They were not outsiders. They were the husband of the woman who taught the children, the brother of the man who managed the food stores. The betrayal was an intimate wound. Confrontation came not with handcuffs or cells, but with a circle of their peers in the newly built communal hall. The accused stood surrounded not by armed guards, but by the faces of those they had lived and worked with for months. Krin himself faced them, his own past a ghost in the room. "You believe you are preserving our strength," he said, his voice thick with a complex grief. "But you have only proven our greatest weakness. You chose to attack our water, the life of our community, because you could not stand the sight of us building a life without an enemy to fight." The leader of the group, a former corporal named Rin, did not deny the charges. His defiance was cold and absolute. "You have made us soft," he spat. "You have traded our birthright for a fairy tale. This world deserves to be conquered, not coddled. True power does not ask for permission." In that moment, the colony faced its most difficult choice. Old instincts demanded punishment, isolation, a crushing of the threat. But their new laws demanded a different path. The penalty for the saboteurs was not imprisonment or exile into the wilds, a death sentence in all but name. Instead, they were assigned to the most difficult, most vital labor the colony faced. They would spend every waking hour helping to rebuild the purification system they had broken, under the watchful eyes of the entire community. They would not be removed. They would be reintegrated, forced to see the direct consequence of their actions and to contribute to the healing. It was a punishment that demanded more from everyone than simple retribution ever could. Could a heart hardened by the old ways ever truly be softened by the relentless, demanding work of peace? Rin was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was the quiet, efficient engineer who had personally calibrated the water purifier's pressure sensors only the week before. His hands, now bound not by rope, but by the solemn gaze of the entire colony, were the same hands that had helped raise the communal hall's central beam. When he spoke, his voice was a low, steady current of defiance. "You call this peace," he said, his eyes locking with Krin's. "I call it a delusion. We are disarming ourselves in a universe that only respects strength. Peace is not a virtue, it is a prelude to extinction. We must be ready to fight or we will be slaughtered." The air in the hall grew thick and still. All eyes turned to Krin, the man who had once embodied the very philosophy Rin now championed. The general stepped forward, and for a moment, the old ghost of command seemed to cling to him. Then he spoke, and his voice was stripped of all its former steel, filled instead with a weary, bone-deep certainty. "I once believed as you do," he said, each word measured and heavy. "I built an army on that belief. I wielded the power of a world's heart as a weapon." He paused, and the memory of Kaelus Prime's final, silent scream seemed to flash in his eyes. "That belief did not make us strong, Rin. It made us blind. It burned our cities, it poisoned our skies, and it shattered the very ground beneath our children's feet. Our world did not fall to an alien fleet. It died from that belief." He took a final step, closing the distance between himself and his former follower, not as a general to a subordinate, but as one survivor to another. And it ends here, with us today. Krin's confession was not a plea. It was a verdict on their entire history and a vow for their future. In that moment, the last ember of the old war truly died, extinguished not by force, but by the unbearable weight of its own consequence. Could a truth so terrible, spoken by the man who had once commanded the abyss, finally cleanse the poison of violence from their new beginning? The first trial on Viridia was held not in a courthouse, but in the communal hall they had all built together. There were no armed guards, no raised platform for a judge. The entire colony formed a circle, with Rin standing in the center, surrounded by the faces of those he had endangered. Zara began the proceedings, her voice calm but unwavering. "We are not here to inflict pain," she said. "We are here to understand it and to heal it. Our judgment will not be about what Rin deserves, but about what our community needs to become whole again." The sentence was unprecedented. Rin would be tasked with leading the team to rebuild the water purifier, working under the supervision of the very people he had betrayed. He would eat with them, labor with them, and face every challenge of the reconstruction as a full member of the team. It was a punishment of responsibility, not of idleness. For days, he worked in sullen silence, his movements efficient but his spirit closed off. He followed the technical schematics with cold precision, but he avoided the eyes of his co-workers. The turning point came during a critical phase, when a secondary filtration tank began to crack under the pressure of a rushed seal. It was Rin who saw the hairline fracture first, a flaw everyone else had missed. Without a word, he shoved a fellow worker out of the way, placing his own body against the leaking tank to redirect the spray while shouting instructions on how to reinforce the seal. In that moment of instinctive, protective action, the wall around him crumbled. When the crisis was averted, he stood there, soaked and breathing heavily, looking at the hands of the people who had just worked alongside him to save their shared water supply. "I was wrong," he said, the words quiet but clear in the sudden stillness. His gaze met Krin's across the worksite. "I thought fear was the only thing that could keep us safe. I was guarding a ghost, a memory of a war that should have died with our world. Fear should not guide us." His admission was not a defeat, but a different kind of strength. It was the sound of a cycle breaking, not with a bang, but with a quiet, personal surrender to a better truth. Could the most powerful redemption be found not in forgiveness from others, but in the hard, honest work of forgiving one's own past self? The sky above Viridia shimmered as the observer's vessel began its silent ascent. Ilara stood beside Zara on the grassy hill overlooking the new settlement, her form already beginning to fade into the golden light of the setting suns. "Our time here is complete." Ilara's voice resonated softly in Zara's mind, a gentle breeze carrying the finality of the moment. "Your journey is your own now." Zara watched the colonists below, their small figures moving with purpose around the rebuilt water purifier and the half-finished dwellings. The memory of Kaelus Prime was a permanent scar on her soul, but she understood the deeper meaning in the observer's words. "Remember your fallen world," Ilara continued, her luminous eyes holding Zara's gaze, "but do not be chained by its ghost. Your strength will come from building upon its lessons, not from mourning its ashes. To live only in the shadow of a catastrophe is to grant that destruction a second victory." The alien ship was a dark sliver against the vibrant orange sky, its edges blurring as it climbed higher. Zara felt a profound stillness settle within her. The observers had given them the ultimate gift, a chance to write a new story without dictating its chapters. They would not return to check on their experiment or to enforce their philosophy. The true test of their transformation would be how they governed themselves when no one was watching. As the vessel dissolved into the star-dusted tapestry of the evening, Zara understood this was not an abandonment. It was an act of profound respect. They were no longer a case study in a galactic archive. They were a people, whole and free, entrusted with their own destiny. Could they honor the memory of a billion lost souls without letting that grief define every choice they made for generations to come? The silence left behind was not empty, but full of potential. The story of Kaelus Prime was no longer a raw wound, but a story told under the twin moons of Viridia. Years had softened the landscape, with fields of golden grain now growing where the first communal hall had stood. On a grassy hill overlooking the settlement, a group of young Vexxar children sat in a circle, their wide eyes fixed on Zara. Her hair was silver now, her face a map of their shared history, but her voice held the same quiet strength that had guided them from the ashes. She spoke of a world of grand spires and shimmering energy, of a people who had everything, and of the war that took it all. She did not speak of tactics or heroes, but of the silence that followed the final explosion, a silence so complete it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. One small girl, her skin dappled in the moonlight, looked up at Zara, her tiny brow furrowed with a terrible, beautiful innocence. Will we ever have war again? The question hung in the warm night air, simple and devastating. Zara reached out, her hand gentle on the child's shoulder. Not if we remember the price, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried to every child in the circle. The price was not a number of ships or soldiers. It was the sound of a billion voices vanishing into static. It was the taste of ash where cities once stood. It is the memory of a sky that was once blue, forever replaced by the cold, eternal dark. To remember the price is to carry the ghost of our old world in our hearts every single day. It is the heaviest weight we bear, and it is the only thing that will keep us light enough to walk this new path. The children were silent, the story of a dead planet settling into their bones, becoming not just a lesson, but a part of who they were. This was how the past was woven into the future, not through laws carved in stone, but through stories whispered on the wind. Could a memory, carefully tended and passed from one generation to the next, truly be the strongest shield a civilization could ever possess? The heart of their new settlement was not a council chamber or a monument, but a library. The archive was a structure of simple, elegant lines, built from the local white stone and nestled in a grove of whispering crystal leaf trees. Inside, the air was cool and carried the scent of aged data crystals and parchment. On row after row of polished shelves sat the entire recorded history of Kaelus Prime, from its first poetic myths to the final, frantic military dispatches. Alongside these sat the cold, clinical records provided by the observers, the chronicles of 6 other worlds that had shared their fate. Commander Vor, his hair now streaked with gray, stood before a group of visiting scholars from a newly contacted system, his hand resting gently on the main console. "This archive is our legacy," he said, his voice echoing softly in the vast, quiet space. "It is not a trophy of our achievements, but a grave marker for our failures. We preserve this not for pride, but as a warning to any civilization that believes itself too advanced to fall. The greatest danger any society faces is not an external threat, but the internal hubris that can destroy a world from the inside." The archive was more than a collection of data. It was a living, breathing memorial. One could call up the architectural schematics for the grand spires and walk through them in a holographic simulation, hearing the echoes of a bustling, unified people. One could then pull up the seismic readouts from the final hours and feel the violent tremor of the planet's death throes. The contrast was deliberately jarring. It forced every visitor to confront the direct line between a society's peak and its absolute abyss. Why build such a painful monument? Because a warning etched in data and memory is far less costly than one written in planetary dust. The survivors of Kaelus Prime had dedicated their new lives to ensuring that their story would never be just another forgotten entry in a cosmic list of tragedies. Could the most profound act of creation be the careful, deliberate preservation of a memory of utter destruction? The crystalline river of Veridia reflected the twin moons as their small diplomatic craft glided over its surface, a vessel built for speed and grace, not for war. Inside, Zara adjusted the simple silver clasp on her tunic, a symbol of her office that held no military rank. She looked at the small team with her, a former rebel soldier, a one-time loyalist engineer, and a young botanist born in the refugee fleet. "We are the living proof of our change," she reminded them, her voice calm. "Our message must be as clear as our history. The alien species, the Thren, were a cautious people who communicated through complex bioluminescent patterns on their sleek, aquatic forms. Their first transmissions had been wary, speaking of ancient conflicts with star-faring empires. They expected demands or perhaps a show of force. They did not expect an unarmed ship and a delegation that stood with empty hands open. Zara stood before the Thren assembly in their submerged crystalline chamber, the water distorting her form into soft ripples. "We come in peace," she began, the translated patterns flowing from her console, bearing the hard-won wisdom of our past. "We are the survivors of a world that no longer exists. We fought a war so absolute. Its only trophy was a cloud of dust where our planet once lived. We are not here to offer you treaties or alliances born from strategy. We are here to offer you our friendship and a single story. The story of how a civilization can be its own most vicious predator." The Thren leaders listened, their own lights flickering with a slow, thoughtful rhythm as Zara spoke not of resources or territorial agreements, but of the great silence, the moment their world's data streams went dead. She spoke of the archive on Veridia, and she made them an offer. "We will give you the full, unedited records of our self-destruction. Every strategic error, every act of betrayal, every scientific warning that was ignored. We offer you the blueprint of our failure, so that you may study it and ensure your own path is different." It was a gesture of vulnerability that no conquering species would ever make. It was not a negotiation, but a gift of tragic knowledge. How do you prove your intentions are pure? You offer your greatest shame as your most valuable offering. The Thren's response was not immediate, but when it came, the patterns that danced across their forms were a soft, deep blue, the color of profound respect. They accepted the archive, and in return, they shared the secrets of the resilient, deep-rooted plants that would finally secure Veridia's food supply against the coming winter. It was a small, practical exchange, but it was built on a foundation of shared understanding, not mutual suspicion. The first thread of a new kind of galactic community had been woven, not from the thread of conquest, but from the stark, unbreakable thread of memory. The Unity Pact was not signed in a grand hall of polished marble, but in the open air of Veridia, under the gentle light of its twin moons. Representatives from a dozen species stood together on a platform grown from living crystal, their forms as varied as their histories. There were the Thren, their bioluminescent skin pulsing with soft, respectful colors. There were the stoic, mineral-based geodes of Ignis, and the avian Sorin from the Lyra constellation, their feathers shimmering. Each had come not because of a shared enemy, but because of a shared fear. The fear of becoming the next entry in the Observer's archive of fallen worlds. They had all heard the story of Kaelus Prime, and in its chilling silence they found a common language. The pact they forged was simple, yet revolutionary. It bound them not in a military alliance, but in a mutual pledge of non-aggression and shared knowledge. They vowed to settle disputes through mediation, to offer aid in times of crisis, and to open their scientific and cultural archives to one another. It was a web of trust, deliberately woven to be stronger than any fleet of warships. When it came time for the Vexxar to add their signature to the pact, it was Krin who stepped forward. His hand, which had once signed orders for planetary-scale weapons, now held a simple stylus. He looked out at the gathered assembly, his gaze resting on each unique, intelligent face. He did not speak of victory or strength. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the clearing with the weight of a world. "From our ashes," he said, "a greater galaxy can arise." He pressed the stylus to the pact, and in that single, deliberate act, the former architect of a world's destruction became a founding architect of its most profound legacy. The Vexxar were no longer just survivors. They had become the keepers of a flame, a living reminder that the most powerful force in the cosmos is not the energy to destroy, but the wisdom to choose not to. Could a promise made under the gentle light of a new moon truly hold back the ancient shadows of conflict? The Unity Pact was their answer, a fragile, defiant yes whispered into the void. Deep within the silent asteroid belt that once circled Kaelus Prime, a faint, rhythmic hum began to register on the Viridia's deep space sensors. It was a ghost of a heartbeat, a resonance that should not exist. A team of scientists, led by a former loyalist geologist named Rel, detected the unique energy signature emanating from a cluster of rocky fragments. The data was undeniable. These were not just asteroids, they were caskets holding the last dying echoes of their planet's core. Rel stared at the spectral analysis, her breath catching. The very energy that had torn their world apart was now sleeping inside these stones, waiting. The discovery split the colony. Many saw only a ghost, a terrifying reminder of the weapon that had killed their world. They argued to leave the asteroids untouched, to let the past remain buried. But Rel and others saw a profound, painful opportunity. What if we could wake that energy for a different purpose? She proposed to the council, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. What if the power that destroyed a world could be used to build new ones? The research was slow, delicate, and fraught with emotional peril. The first attempts to draw a trickle of energy from a sample resulted in a violent, miniature chain reaction that vaporized the testing chamber. It was a stark warning of the volatile nature of their work, but they persisted, developing containment fields based on the very stabilization principles that had failed in the final hours of Kaelus Prime. Slowly, painstakingly, they learned to coax the energy out, not in a destructive blast, but in a steady, manageable flow. They were not mining a fuel, they were taming a ghost, teaching a force of pure destruction how to create. The first successful application was a single, sustained beam of warm, golden light that powered Viridia's entire agricultural grid for an entire season, causing the crops to grow with impossible vigor and resilience. They called it the Phoenix Protocol. The very essence of their dead world was now nourishing the soil of their new one. How do you reconcile the source of your greatest grief becoming the means of your greatest hope? The colonists found themselves tending gardens and powering their homes with the gentle, repurposed echo of the cataclysm that had made them orphans. It was the ultimate act of alchemy, turning the leaden memory of annihilation into the gold of a sustainable future. This was their final, defiant answer to the war, not to hide from the power they had misused, but to master it with a wisdom paid for in the dust of 1 billion souls. The polished black stone of the memorial was a mirror to the sky, its surface so dark it seemed to swallow the light. It stood in the very center of the settlement, a silent sentinel carved from the heart of their grief. Every single name of the billion souls lost on Kaelus Prime was etched into its face, a galaxy of tiny, silver characters that glimmered in the sun. The sheer scale of it was a physical weight, a testament to a loss so vast it could never be quantified, only felt. The entire colony stood before it, a quiet sea of faces reflecting the monument's solemn truth. Zara stepped forward, her hand resting for a moment on the cool stone as if she could feel the echoes of all those lives. Her voice, when she spoke, did not echo. It was absorbed by the stone and the collective silence of the people. We built this not to dwell in the past, but to carry its weight with us into the future. Every name here represents a story cut short, a future unwritten, a family broken. They are not forgotten. Their loss, this profound and permanent absence, is what fuels our commitment to peace. It is the fire that forges our resolve, the foundation upon which every one of our laws is built. A single, quiet sob broke the silence from somewhere in the crowd, a sound of grief that was also a sound of release. The monument was not a place for speeches or celebration. It was a place for truth. It made the abstract horror of a dead world terrifyingly personal. A child could run a finger over the name of a grandparent they would never meet. A friend could find the name of a comrade and remember a shared laugh. It transformed a planetary statistic into 1 million individual tragedies, each one a reason why the path of war must never be walked again. How do you measure the true cost of conflict? You do not count the ships or the weapons. You stand before a wall of 1 billion names and feel the silence. The election was a quiet affair, held not with grand speeches but with a simple show of hands in the communal hall. When the final count was announced, a profound silence fell, deeper than any cheer could have been. Commander Vor, the soldier who had fought his way to the heart of a dying world, was now the first chancellor of a society that had renounced war. He stepped onto the simple wooden platform, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those he had led through fire and into the fragile light of a new dawn. "My hands are no cleaner than any here," he began, his voice carrying the weight of shared memory. "They have held weapons, they have pulled triggers, they have felt the shudder of a planet breaking apart. But today they are empty." He opened his palms to the assembly, a gesture of radical vulnerability. "I accept this charge not as a commander but as a servant. I will lead with the compassion we learned too late on Kaelus." It was a promise that redefined leadership itself. His authority would not be drawn from the barrel of a gun or the weight of a title, but from a shared commitment to a painful, hard-won truth. The ideals of the rebellion, once a desperate cry in the darkness, were now the bedrock of their entire civilization. Every policy, every decision would be filtered through that single, solemn vow. How do you govern a people when your greatest strength is a willingness to be vulnerable? Vor's first act as chancellor was to establish the weekly public forum, a space where any colonist, from the eldest engineer to the youngest child, could voice a concern or propose an idea. He did not sit on a raised dais, but on the same level as everyone else, listening with a patience forged in the fires of loss. He understood that the compassion he pledged was not a softness, but the most durable form of strength they possessed. It was the glue that would hold their fragile new world together, a constant reminder that they were building a home, not just occupying territory. The soldier had become a gardener, tending not to crops, but to the delicate roots of trust itself. Krin found his new battlefield in the quiet spaces between arguments. He began teaching conflict resolution not from a place of theory, but from the raw, lived experience of a man who had commanded armies. His classroom was a simple, open-walled pavilion overlooking the river, and his students were farmers, engineers, and parents. He did not speak of grand strategy. He spoke of de-escalation. He used his intimate knowledge of military tactics to teach people how to recognize the early maneuvers of a verbal conflict, how to identify the high ground in a disagreement before anyone felt the need to attack. "I was trained to see every problem as a target," he would tell them, his voice calm and measured. "I was taught that overwhelming force was the only solution." But true strength is not in being the loudest voice in the room. It is in being the one who can truly listen. His most powerful lesson was a simple diagram he would draw in the sand. On one side, he sketched the rigid, hierarchical structure of his old army, a pyramid with one voice at the top. On the other, he drew a web, a network of interconnected lines. "The pyramid is strong until you remove the top stone," he explained. "Then the entire structure collapses. But a web, if one thread breaks, the whole remains. It is flexible. It can absorb a shock. Our community is a web. We must learn to mend the threads, not break them." One afternoon, a deep disagreement erupted between the agricultural and engineering guilds over water rights for a new field. The old tensions flared, the language turning sharp. Krin did not command or dictate a solution. He simply walked between the two groups and asked a single, piercing question. "What is the shared resource you are both truly trying to protect? Is it the water, or is it the future of Veridia?" The question reframed the entire conflict. They were not opponents fighting for a limited supply. They were partners trying to solve the same problem. Under his guidance, they designed a new, more efficient irrigation system together. After the agreement was reached, a young engineer approached him, her expression one of awe. "Sir, you have changed so much." Krin looked out at the thriving settlement, the sounds of construction and children's laughter filling the air. "I was a destroyer of worlds," he said, the words holding no pride, only a quiet, factual weight. "Now I will be a builder of bridges. It is the only redemption that matters." In that simple pavilion, the general who had once shattered continents was now patiently, meticulously, teaching people how to mend the smallest of tears in their social fabric. Could the man who had perfected the art of war become its most effective dismantler? The first cry was not one of fear, but of pure, unburdened life. It echoed through the settlement's medical bay, a sound so ordinary and yet so profound that it silenced every conversation outside the door. The child was a boy, his skin bearing the faint, healthy luminescence of a native Viridian. When Zara was brought to him, her breath caught. She saw no trace of the gray ash of Kaelus Prime in his clear eyes, no echo of its final scream in his peaceful coos. He was a perfect blank page, and the responsibility of that nearly overwhelmed her. The parents, a former rebel medic and a loyalist architect, had already chosen his name. They called him Kaelus. It was not a name meant to chain him to a ghost, but to honor the billion souls whose sacrifice had made his peaceful first breath possible. He was their promise to the past. When Zara took the infant into her arms, his tiny hand curled around her finger with a grip that felt like the future itself. Her voice was a soft whisper, a blessing for the child and a vow for them all. "You represent our future," she said, her gaze holding the entire gathered community. "A future free from the shadows of war. You will learn of our old world not as a call to arms, but as a lesson in the cost of hatred. Your hands will know the soil, not the trigger of a weapon." This child, Kaelus, was their most powerful symbol. He was living proof that they were no longer merely survivors clinging to life. They were a people building a lineage, a chain of generations that would inherit not a battlefield, but a garden. Every lullaby sung to him would be a song of peace. Every story told would be a careful weaving of memory and hope. How do you ensure the horrors of the past are never repeated? You raise a new generation that sees them not as glory, but as a solemn, sacred warning. In the weight of that tiny, sleeping child, the entire colony felt the heavy, beautiful burden of their purpose solidify. They were not just building a settlement. They were building a legacy, and its name was Kaelus. The sky above Veridia shimmered with a familiar, impossible geometry. The observer's vessel descended not as a conqueror, but as a guest, its silent form a stark silhouette against the golden dawn. It settled in the meadow just beyond the thriving settlement, a place now filled with the sounds of children and the scent of baking bread. From the vessel, Ilara emerged. Her form was as serene as they remembered, her luminous eyes taking in the scene before her. She did not walk toward the Grand Archive or the Council Hall. She walked toward the communal gardens, where colonists young and old were tending to rows of vibrant, alien vegetables. Zara and Vor, their hair now fully silver but their posture still straight, met her there, their hands stained with soil. Ilara's gaze swept over the irrigation channels powered by the Phoenix Protocol, over the laughing children who knew war only as a story from the archive, over the simple, beautiful architecture that spoke of community, not defense. A profound, gentle resonance filled the air around them, a feeling of peace so deep it felt like a physical warmth. "You have not merely survived," Ilara's voice resonated in their minds, a sound like a quiet chime. "You have transcended. We have watched your progress, the steady, deliberate building of a society upon the most fragile of foundations, a vow. You took the memory of absolute destruction and used it not as a weapon, but as a compass." Her luminous eyes held Zara's and then Vor's, and then moved to encompass the entire, bustling settlement. "You have become a beacon in the darkness." Your story, the chronicle of Kaelus Prime and the birth of Veridia, will now be shared with other emerging civilizations. It will be a testament that the cycle of self-annihilation is not inevitable. It is a choice, and you have shown them a different one. The weight of her words settled over them, not as a burden, but as a confirmation. They were no longer just a case study in a galactic tragedy. They were a living, breathing answer to the observer's ancient, sorrowful question. Their peace was no longer an experiment. It had become a legacy, a light cast across the void to guide others away from the same terrible precipice. What greater purpose can a people have than to turn their greatest failure into another civilization's most vital warning? The gentle hum of the settlement was the only music for Zara's final walk to the meeting circle. Her steps were slow, each one a measured beat in the long, quiet rhythm of the peace she had helped build. The entire colony had gathered, from the eldest who remembered the scream of tearing metal to the youngest, who knew war only as a ghost story from the archive. She stood before them, her hands, once clenched in defiance, now open and resting on the smooth wood of the speaker's rail. Her gaze traveled across the faces, these people who were her family, her redemption, her living testament. "You are the guardians of a fragile flame," she began, her voice a soft rustle that commanded absolute silence. "My generation pulled that flame from the absolute darkness of our world's ending. We have tended it, sheltered it, and built a hearth for it here on Veridia. But now the fire must pass to your hands." She looked directly at the young adults in the crowd, at the engineers, the farmers, the teachers, and the artists who had never held a weapon. "Guard this peace as your most precious treasure. Do not mistake its quiet for weakness. It is the strongest thing we have ever built, forged in the fire of 1,000,000,000 lost souls. It is not a passive state, but an active choice you must make every single day." The formal transfer was a simple act. She placed a date, a crystal, into the hand of her chosen successor, a woman named Lyra, whose life's work had been the study of conflict resolution, not its execution. "This crystal contains no strategic secrets or weapons schematics," Zara said, her voice gaining a final, firm strength. "It holds the unedited personal logs from the final days of Kaelus Prime. The fear, the desperation, the moment the transmission from the surface became eternal static. Let this be your true guide. Let the silence of our dead world be the loudest voice in your ear when you are tempted by pride, by fear, or by the old, seductive lie that power can be won through force." With that, she stepped back, merging into the circle of her people, no longer a leader but an elder, a living memory. The torch had been passed not with a shout, but with a whisper that would echo through the centuries. Could a new generation, born into the gentle light of peace, truly understand the terrible cost of the darkness that came before? Their commitment would be the only answer that mattered. The gentle hum of the colony was a lullaby, a sound Zara never took for granted. She stood on her balcony, watching the lights of Veridia twinkle like grounded stars, each one a testament to a choice made differently. The soft laughter of children playing in the twilight, the distant, harmonious clang from the craftsman's quarter, the scent of night-blooming flowers on the warm air, this was the symphony of their hard-won peace. It was a living, breathing thing, more powerful than any weapon they had ever forged. Her own reflection in the glass was a map of their journey, each line etched not by time alone, but by memory. She closed her eyes, and the words formed not as a speech, but as a final, quiet truth meant for the stars themselves. "Our world died in fire and pride." Her voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of continents. It died because we forgot that strength is not measured by the power to dominate, but by the wisdom to preserve. We turned our greatest gift, the very heart of our planet, into a cudgel to bludgeon our own people. But from its ashes, we built a new home founded on wisdom and unity. We chose to remember the scream of 1,000,000,000 voices, not as a call to vengeance, but as a permanent guide. We chose to see our shared survival as our only true victory. Below, a young couple walked hand in hand, their forms silhouetted against the warm glow of the communal hall. They were the future, a future that would never know the specific terror of a sky torn by energy weapons, but would always be taught the cost of such a sky. "Let our story be a warning," she whispered, her gaze lifting to the star-dusted void where the ghost of Kaelus Prime still drifted, a pale cloud of regret. A warning that no cause, no ideology is worth the price of a world, but let it also be a hope. Her voice strengthened, filled with the conviction of a woman who had seen the very worst and helped create something better. Hope that a people can change. Hope that the cycle of violence is not an unbreakable chain. We proved that from the deepest darkness, a new light can be kindled. The war is over, but the journey toward peace never ends. It is a path we walk every day in every kind word, in every mended disagreement, in every child raised to understand that their greatest inheritance is not land or power, but a promise. A promise whispered on the wind, carried in the soil, and etched into the very soul of their new home. The promise to remember and to choose differently.